of Africa. You see, they viewed themselves that way. Menes, the founder of Egypt himself, was from Upper Egypt. And sometimes people say Upper Egypt, you think of North. No, Upper Egypt means the South. Lower Egypt is the North. And that's the orientation. They saw that, you see. So when you read about Upper Egypt, you're reading about the southern, you're reading about Nubia, actually. You're reading about Sudan. You're reading about those are the areas from which the people who built the Egyptian culture came from. So this attack on Kevin Hart is really because people have little information. They don't know very much. And I found that when I've traveled in Kemet, but not in Egypt, but it's not just in Egypt, it's everywhere in the continent, and it's also in this country. People don't know very much about Africa. They have very little understanding. They don't know, for example, that the Greeks learned from the black Egyptians, that the black people in Egypt taught the Greeks geometry and mathematics and medicine, law and architecture and astronomy and philosophy and religion even. The first name of God was announced on the continent of Africa. No other people announced the name of God before the African people, you see. And in terms of just understanding this tradition, there are a couple of things I want to point out, because I'm going to get to because people want to know, well, how did the Arabs get to the point where they are saying that it was not black-skinned people who built Egypt? Well, they get to this point because of conquest. But conquest is a very interesting thing. And as you will see, I have some names for these conquerors and how they do it. But right now, let me just show you what we learned from Africa itself. And this is the evidence from Strabo, one of the writers, ancient writers of Europe, said, for example, geometry was invented, it is said, from the measurement of lands, which is made necessary by the Nile when it confounds the boundaries of the time of its overflows. This science then is believed to have come to the Greeks from the Egyptians. Where's geometry from? The fact that the Nile overflowed its banks and destroyed different farms and lands, and you had to parcel out the land again after the floods. You had to divide it, measure it. So if you had to measure it, then you create drawing lines. You know what I'm saying? And making, if you had so many square feet before or meters, then we give you the same amount. You see, that's where geometry came from. Anybody who tells you that the Greeks created geometry, then must be lying. Because the Greeks themselves say that they got it from Egypt. But look at this. Not only that, the science which relates neither to pleasure nor yet to the necessities of life were invented first in those places where men had leisure. Thus the mathematical sciences originated in Egypt because there the priestly class had leisure. Who said that? The Greek Aristotle. He didn't claim, Aristotle didn't say, I'm going to claim, as a Greek, I'm going to claim that we did this, we had it. No, he said, no. It came from Africa. He specifically said it in his book, Metaphysics. He writes this. So we know geometry and mathematics come from Africa. Egypt is in Africa. That's why I showed you the map. There's no other continent, you see. I mean, I know people are confused by that because I spoke to a 7th grade class in Buffalo, New York a few years ago and asked them on which continent is Egypt, and they said Europe. So how do you think people come to that? I was discussing with Brother Beretta here earlier today about how people are miseducated. How somebody come with the thought that Egypt is in Europe, and they're in school. They're learning. They're going to be leaders, presidents and stuff. you know. And this is the knowledge that they have. But then philosophy also comes from Africa. Thales, and that name you may not have heard of, but Thales was the first Greek philosopher. That means he's before Socrates, he's before Isocrates, he's before Plato, he's before Aristotle. He's the first Greek philosopher, Thales, right? Thales had no instructor except the Egyptian priest with whom he spent time in Egypt. That's according to Diogenes. That's what he writes. He said, even Thales, the first of the Greek philosophers, had no instructor except the black people. Who else instructed him in philosophy? Thales of Miletus made voyages to the priests and the astronomers of Egypt, and according to his biographers, he learned geometry from the Egyptians. He learned all kinds of things from the Egyptians, you see. So now I'm building up to you to tell you why the Arabs have taken the position that they have taken. They're taking the same position the Europeans took. Isocrates wrote in his book called Bucerus. He says, of whom Pythagoras of Samos, and we heard about the Pythagorean theorem, right, by Pythagoras. Pythagoras of Samos is one. On a visit to Egypt, he became a student of the religion of the people and was first to bring to the Greeks all philosophy, not just a little bit of it. He brought all philosophy, and more conspicuously than others, he seriously interested himself in sacrifices and in ceremonial purity. Who's writing about him? Socrates, who was a philosopher who lived after Pythagoras. He says Pythagoras, Thales, first philosopher of note of the Greeks. Pythagoras, second philosopher of note of the Greeks, and Pythagoras spent 22 years in Egypt. And what do they bring to Greece when they go back home? They brought philosophy. You can't even, so there's no discussion here. There's no argument. Even the Greeks themselves said it, and they laid it out. In fact, Herodotus said this about the Greek borrowing from Egypt. Melampus, who was a wise man, acquired the art of divination, having become acquainted with the worship of Bacchus through knowledge derived from Egypt, introduced it into Greece. That's why George G.M. James, a great African scholar who taught at the Black College in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, wrote the great book in the 1950s called Stolen Legacy. There is no Greek philosophy. There is only stolen African philosophy. And he proved it, line by line. Herodotus wrote also on the oracles of Dodona and Libya. And let me just say that this notion of the oracles was founded principally in Africa itself. That is where particularly leaders of nations would go to the temples, and they would speak to the priests and the priestesses at the temples. And the priests and priestesses at the temples, through the magic of their voices, would speak to them. This may even be where the Catholics got, where you go do the confessions and talk to somebody and somebody talks to you back. Well, those are the oracles. That's what the oracles were like that, you see. But what we know about them is that Herodotus, who was a Greek historian, in the 5th century, says, this was what I heard from the priest of Waset. Waset is a city in Egypt that today they call Luxor. Waset is one of the most ancient cities in the whole world. That's where the Temple of Karnak is. We've been there many times. He says, at Dodona, however, the women who deliver the oracles relate the matter as follows. Here's what they say about it. 2 black doves flew away from Egyptian Waset, from Luxor, and while one directed its flight to Libya, the other came to them in Greece. So even the oracles in Greece, just like the ones in Libya, came from these black doves, these women. And in fact, he goes on to talk about the sound of their voice. Two of the sacred women, priestesses, were carried from Waset by Phoenicians. One was sold into Libya and the other into Greece. And these women were the first founders of the oracles in the 2 countries. The most religious, at the very basis of religion, 2 black women. One for Greece, one for Libya. This is a fact. Herodotus writes this in the book Histories. Ancient Egyptians and what I call assemblies. I once heard someone give a talk about commencement exercises. And they said, well, you know, the commencement exercise starts with the medieval Europeans when they would dress in their robes and they would march in and so on, coming from the monasteries. It's not true. It's not true. They used to say that all the time, even at temple.